Okay. Is there a way to know if it's on?
The red light.
Okay.
Everyone, I see a few more people coming in through the door, and I'm sure we'll have some others on this sunny day hopefully come inside for an hour for our talk. Welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in Urban Studies and Planning and director of OTREC, and along with my colleagues, Professor John Glebe, Professor Miguel Figliozzi, we help organize the transportation seminar this term. So welcome everyone. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to remind everyone that we do webcast the seminars, and so in order for the people watching on the web to hear the questions that you're going to be asking later for our discussion, please use the microphones on each of the tables. Hit the touch button area. Keep the red light lit while you're asking your questions so people can hear. If you don't have a microphone nearby, or if it's broken, I'll try to come with the portable mic so we make sure your question is heard and recorded for posterity. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce a good friend of mine, actually, and colleague, Lewison Lem. Lewison got his PhD in urban planning at UCLA and has worked at a number of places, including the EPA, working on environment, transportation, air quality work, and some other places. Right now, he is a principal consultant at Jack Faucett Associates, and he is their climate change practice leader. He's been working on a lot of climate action plans throughout the country, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lewison. One last thing I forgot, in terms of questions, there's going to be a couple points during his talk that will be sort of an obvious place to start asking questions. So if we could hold off till those points, that would be great. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for showing up today. I'm very happy to have a chance to come and speak here at Portland State University again. I have come before, and I think the last 2 times I spoke about gasoline fuel prices. That was a few years ago. And then I was speaking about the state climate action plans maybe 1.5, 2 years ago. That was at the time when there were a lot of states undertaking climate action plans, and there was quite a bit of activity. I think the peak of that was probably 2008, which was an election year. There were a lot of things going on. My talk today is a little more focused. I'm focusing on 3 particular areas that we're finding are promising areas for greenhouse gas reductions. And as the plans of states and local governments and agencies and other organizations are moving from planning to implementation, and there's more analysis coming out, we're seeing more data and more evidence for things. So I think we're better able to assess what's promising, what's not, and better able to sort of get a handle on where the greenhouse gas emissions reductions are likely to come from in the transportation sector. So I was thinking about it today. I wanted to say that I'm going to make an offer, sort of a standing offer to people, that if anybody can find me 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from the transportation sector, then I will buy them a drink. And if you can find me 10, then I'll buy you 2 drinks. So that's kind of like what we're doing here in the transportation sector. The transportation sector, I think, is actually has a lot to reach for, and we're still trying to figure out how to get there. But that's a little bit of what I'm trying to talk about today. So some of these early slides are just providing some background. Again, this is a slide showing the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. It's hard to not have seen something like this with all the news and information that's been going on around about climate change in the past few years. So this is data, for example, from there's a famous observatory in Hawaii where they measure the carbon dioxide levels, and so this sort of shows the trend upwards, especially during the period of industrialization. The scientific community has given us a goal at the global level of a certain concentration level that they think is a stabilization scenario for greenhouse gases. And that goal is somewhere in this range of 450 to 550 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. And so the general story overall, and for the transportation sector in specific, is to try to move from that blue line, the business as usual curve, try to bend the curve down to reach somewhere in between the yellow and the red line, which would be a stabilization scenario. For the transportation sector in particular, we have pretty good inventory data in the US. At the national level, this is recent, a few years ago, but it's pretty steady. The transportation sector contributes about 28% to the overall US greenhouse gas emissions, second to electricity generation. And as we start to look at different local levels or different geographies, different states, different cities, and so forth, we sort of see that 28%, of course it varies depending upon where you are and so forth. These are just three comparisons for the city of Baltimore, the county of Baltimore, and the state of Maryland. And so I'm just trying to show you here the transportation share. And you can see that for the city it's about 24%. For the county it's as high as 42%. It depends on what else is going on in the area that you're measuring. But transportation is clearly one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a slide actually I borrowed from Damon Fordham, who used to be in Oregon and went to Washington, D.C. This is a presentation of sort of a concept of where the potential for greenhouse gas emission reductions might come from in the transportation sector. And so this slide shows at the bottom of a triangle more efficient cars, more efficient vehicles, and the second sort of segment of the triangle being fuels, lower carbon fuels, and then splits up the top between travel and VMT and optimizing the system. And I think that's referring to the transportation system. So part of the story I'd like to tell is how we sort of have a little bit of a success story with regard to the car standards. We've sort of moved from a period that when we had not updated the CAFE standards for a long time, and we did update the CAFE standards, and part of that had to do with, I believe, the states as well stepping forward and saying that they wanted to have state standards that were going to be stronger than the pre-existing national CAFE standards. And so what we have now with the current administration is implementation of a set of harmonized standards where the federal and the state standards for light-duty cars and light-duty trucks would be harmonized. This graph sort of shows you some of the numbers. This is miles per gallon on the vertical. And these two lines show you the estimates for the overall light-duty fleet. These two lines show you the estimates for the new vehicles that are entering into the fleet. So what you can see here is that the red line shows that in the year 2020, the new cars would have reached a fleet average of 35.5 miles per gallon. And the new harmonized standards, what we refer to as the Obama standards or the Obama CAFE, moves that 35 forward actually in time from 2020. It moves it forward to 2016. And that harmonizes it with the California Clean Car Standards and the goals of the other states that were planning to adopt the California Clean Car Standards. So I think this is probably the most obvious example of a success story in terms of policy advancement. The cars that are coming out will be more fuel efficient and more have a reduced level of emissions of greenhouse gases. So having said that about vehicles, and especially light-duty vehicles, the questions remain sort of, well, how do we continue to bend that curve down going forward? Where do we find more tons? And if any of you, want to get a free drink, if you can help us look for 5 million tons somewhere from the transportation sector, we'd really appreciate it. So one area that we're looking at is low-carbon fuels. The fuels themselves, rather than the vehicles, are what we're talking about. There was a lot of interest when we were going around the States. There was a lot of interest in biofuels, and I think there was a lot of hope that biofuels would be maybe even a silver bullet, have a great potential for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. There's been much more study of this, and there are much more sort of complicated angles to the biofuels story. And what we're showing here is that on the cost side, the dollars per ton estimates to achieve those greenhouse gas emissions reductions from biofuels are positive. It's significant that it's positive because that's different from the situation you have, say, with the car standards. With the car standards, especially the ones that have recently been passed, the analysis shows that you get a net dollar savings. And the reason is that even though it might cost more to build a car or to purchase a car that's more fuel efficient, you get that savings back by the reduction in the amount of gasoline that you're purchasing. Now, that's not the case with biofuels. This is a situation where the one strategy is more of an energy efficiency strategy, while biofuels is more of a renewable fuels strategy. And as we see with renewable fuels in other sectors, there's a cost involved. And so there's quite a bit of debate that you see about solar and wind and so forth on the electricity side about what are the costs and who's going to bear the costs. And likewise, I think we're seeing a similar sort of discussion about biofuels. And the discussion about this policy-wise also has to do with to what extent the federal government should be subsidizing the production or the purchase of biofuels in some way in order to make the cost more attractive to the end user, to the end consumer. So this is some data that we have. We've got about 50 states worth of data based on some of the state plan work we've been doing. This just shows you a range and then the national average, but it's definitely in the positive territory for biofuels. In terms of the policy tool, sort of the way that you can get to lower carbon fuels, there's been increased interest in this tool called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which I describe more as a performance standard. It's more of a performance goal. This is a very different kind of policy tool than what was usually more commonly used as far as biofuels. The federal government and many states have what's called a renewable fuel standard for biofuels, where they will say by some year, by X year, we're going to try to have Y% of the fuel being consumed being biofuels. And a relatively sort of straightforward number might be 10% ethanol by some year, or X% biodiesel for the trucks by some year. So that's the structure of the policy for a renewable fuel standard. What the low carbon fuel standard does is it's very different. They don't say you're going to have this type of fuel by a certain year. They say whatever the fuel is by that year, we want it to have this level of carbon performance. And so it's usually X% reduction in carbon intensity by a certain year. So what this performance goal enables you to do, though, is it enables you to consider many different pathways to get to that goal. And I think this is why the low carbon fuel standard is becoming more of interest and more actively sort of moving towards implementation in states and around the country and around the world. There may be different pathways to get to that reduction in carbon level within the fuels, carbon intensity within the fuels. It might be biofuels to some degree. It might be electricity, it might be hydrogen fuel cells, it might be natural gas. The point is that there may be many pathways to get to that goal. In addition to that, there are analyses that you can do about combining vehicle technologies with fuels, and also looking at the potential reduction for greenhouse gas emissions from the fuel as well as from the electricity that might be involved if you're talking about a plug-in hybrid or a straight electric vehicle. So this is just showing you a list of states that is considering the low carbon fuel standard, and then on the right side, the regions of the country that are probably more active in considering this set of policies. And this is the results of an analysis that we did for the state of New Jersey, where we looked at a couple of different potential pathways towards trying to reduce fuel intensity of carbon. And if you look at that from a cost perspective, you can see also that you can start to compare the cost of these different pathways. One of the things I would just point out is that we have a bar for what's called conventional electricity, which is going to be, some kind of mix of electric power source. In certain parts of the country, that's more likely to include coal. In other places, there would be more, on this side of the country, maybe more water, more cleaner power. But so the point here of this slide is partly to show you that it does depend on where the electric power is coming from. And it also shows you that depending upon the costs involved, you can start to compare these different pathways and these different strategies and start to consider what might be different ways to get to the emissions reductions in a cost-effective way. So that's sort of the end point of the first part of what I wanted to talk about low carbon fuels. And I guess we could take some questions if anybody wants to ask questions about any of that. Yeah. Oh, and please use your microphone so everybody can hear
you. When determining the carbon footprint of biofuels, is the production taken into account as well, or is it just the actual burning of the fuel that determines the carbon footprint?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's one that early on people were thinking mostly about the combustion, but we've gotten to a point, I think, we've sort of progressed where we look at the whole life cycle fuel, the whole life cycle production of carbon greenhouse gases. So that has to do with we talk about it like from well to wheels, basically, the whole production process for the fuels. Yes.
I have a question about this biofuel. I'm sorry. No, I have it here.
Great, thanks.
I'm sorry about that. I keep forgetting it. My question is, we were talking using biofuels, but do we have enough resources to keep producing that for future generation? Is that a sustainable solution? Or is just we, at this point in time, we want to fix the issue, and then we know that after 50 years we ran out of resources?
I think that's also a good question, and one that people are asking. There have been more studies around the world about this, sort of talking about how much land would be required to produce a certain amount of biofuels. And of course it depends on what type of crop, what type of feedstock you're talking about. So there's more analysis, there's more information about that. I don't know that there's any simple answer I can give you. But it's a very important part of the question, yes. There's a question over here. You had a question?
Microphone. Oh, here. It's fine. No, they pretty much touched on it. So.
Okay, who is, yeah, go ahead in the back.
Yeah, I had a question. You showed a slide and it was saying states considering the low carbon fuel standards, and I'm just exactly what are the low carbon fuel standards being considered? Like, is that complete replacement of carbon-based fuels, or is that just increased usage?
They set, like when we were working with states on the state climate action plans, often there's a goal. It might be an aspirational goal, but it's a goal that's sort of, a certain year, reducing carbon intensity by a certain amount. The most common one is reducing carbon intensity by 10% by a certain year. And I think, one of the reasons why that 10% was adopted as a goal is that that was what was adopted for the state of California, and the state of California is actually moving forward with the low carbon fuel standard. So there was one state I just want to point out, Iowa, where we work with the folks in Iowa, and they actually wanted to reduce carbon intensity even more than 10%. So that's the way these goals are structured.
And so the New Jersey, is that the dollar values there, is that just per ton of carbon fuel replaced, that's the cost, or is that for a set?
Yeah, that's per ton. So when we present costs, we generally present them as dollar per ton in order to be able to compare them. And so this is not a total number cost, but it's sort of a average dollar per ton cost. Yeah, in the back.
So an answer to clarify your answer to the very first question, this price includes $1 costing for the carbon emitted during production? How do you capture the cost of production?
This is intended to be a life cycle cost. That's what we would call it, a life cycle cost. Yeah. If it's all right with folks, we have two other sections to the presentation. If it's okay with you, I want to try to keep moving and then take some more questions as we go. This is really actually 3 presentations. It's the second presentation is about transit and smart growth, or transit and land use, which is another area where there's a lot of interest in seeing how much you can reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector. This is another slide that I borrowed. This was a slide just showing the vehicle miles of travel, the VMT, for the state of Oregon. I believe that's on the highway system. If you look at these trend lines for other states, they sort of have this shape where VMT basically has been growing basically since the post-World War II years. And there have been some dips. You sort of see points at which there's some slowing of the growth or something. During oil shock years is usually where you see some bend in the curve. And then, of course, the most recent one is with this most recent period where you had high oil prices and high gasoline and diesel prices. And so the economists, of course, would say, well, that's what you expect, as the prices go up. This is just for Oregon. I want to just show that one to you, but I want to show you the next one, which is for the state of New Jersey. This one is done on a miles per year per person basis. This one is actually a little bit easier, I think, to relate to, because if you have a car and you can think about how many miles you drive per year with your car and sort of put this number in some perspective. New Jersey, and we've done some work for New Jersey, New Jersey actually starts out at a place where the miles per gallon in recent years is lower than the national average. You can see the peak of this curve was between 8,500 and 9,000 miles per year per person per car, and that's below the national average. So in terms of vehicle miles traveled per person, New Jersey is a relatively, you might say, VMT efficient state, and yet you still see a dip, quite a significant dip in per capita VMT with the recent period of high oil prices. So the question arose, while we were working with the state of New Jersey, the question arose, well, what's likely to happen and what's the potential for VMT trends to go down even further in terms of maybe not reduction in absolute VMT, but maybe reduction in the growth rate of VMT is what people are interested in. And so we did a little analysis for the state of New Jersey where we looked at a baseline scenario, and the baseline forecast was in the absence of new technologies or new best practices. So that was the starting point, the baseline scenario. VMT had been increasing for the state of New Jersey at a rate of about 1.7% per year. And so our projection based on that historic growth rate was that you would have 82.6 billion VMT in the year 2020. That would be a baseline scenario, a business as usual scenario. And then what they wanted to know was whether VMT could be held to a level of 1% per year, from VMT growth, rather, from 1.7% per year growth to 1% growth rate per year. And that would result in 74.5 billion VMT in 2020, which is a significant reduction in VMT. And the question was related to the New Jersey climate plan. So, if this were plausible, if this were possible, it would result in a significant amount of associated greenhouse gas emissions. And so we did an analysis, and we sort of showed a scenario where this could happen, where the growth rate for VMT in the state of New Jersey could go from this historic 1.7% per year, and going forward might be reduced to 1% growth rate per year. An important part of that scenario was taking into account a significant increase in investment in transit and an associated increase in sort of land use patterns that would be supportive of transit, and as well as other measures. There's this research literature that comes out. This is from something called the Millennium Database, where they looked at the fuel use for different urban areas around the world. And they found that there's a pattern of different fuel use in different urban areas in different parts of the world. And the US and Canadian cities tend to be at the high end of fuel use per capita, and other parts of the world tend to be somewhere else on that curve. So we know empirically that there's a possibility of differences. We also see that within the US. It's just that the range of difference, is more compressed between US cities and US states. There's also more data coming out. This is a map, a GIS map of the New York metro region, New York City metro region. And this shows carbon emissions on a per capita basis. The reason why some folks put this slide together is they're trying to show that on a per capita basis, the most efficient or the least GHG emitting sort of locations were in the most urbanized part of New York City, on Manhattan and some of the other parts of the 5 boroughs. And this is, not surprising, but now we sort of have some of this data in order to look at this happening. So I think what a lot of people are interested in, and what we're doing some work in, is related to this question of sort of how do you get there, or can an area change? Much like, the story of Portland, one of the things that Portland is known for is the degree to which people maybe drive their cars a little bit less than other parts of the country. And so this recent work that's come out about the connection between transit and land use, I think has been able to shed some light on this question. It used to be that we would have some idea transit and land use are connected to each other, but maybe we're not quite sure exactly how you analyze that. But the literature starts to show us that there's this leverage factor. For every, say, passenger mile of transit use, you might say there's 1 mile of vehicle use that's kind of displaced because the person is using transit. And somebody might think that, well, it's a one-to-one relationship. If I'm not driving my car and I'm riding transit instead, I'm still going to the same place. It's a one-to-one relationship. But in fact, as you look at the data, you find that there's some kind of leveraging going on between the transit use and the land use patterns. And in different parts of the world, in different cities, in different urban areas, that leveraging factor differs. And so we're starting to see some of this data, and we're starting to understand more of what's going on here. This idea of transit and land use leveraging has been recognized by the US DOT, the Federal Transit Administration, and by the Association of Public Transit Agencies. And they're trying to get the word out and sort of look at the situation and understand it better, working with the different transit agencies. And the transit agencies are very interested in this question because, number one, they are responsible providing the transit service, but also they're recognizing that in providing that transit service, they may be actually reducing VMT or fuel use or greenhouse gas emissions to a higher degree than people might have originally thought. If people thought originally it was just a 1-to-1 ratio, there's more evidence coming out now that it's higher than 1-to-1, and the question is just how much is that? So this is just some data about transit agencies on this slide. This shows you the GHG emissions that the transit agencies are responsible for producing by their own operations. This one on the left is for the Philadelphia region, and the one on the right is for the New York City metro region. And these agencies have done this analysis in order to estimate their own carbon footprint, their own GHG emissions. And then they've tried to think about this question of the leveraging. So in terms of emissions produced by transit, the transit agency is responsible for the tailpipe emissions from their own vehicles, electricity used for the traction power for, for the light rail or for the rail systems. And then if they have buildings consuming energy using electricity, that's what the transit agency is responsible for producing. But on the other hand, that production of emissions is also balanced against some kind of displacement of emissions in the wider community. And we know that there's something going on with that mode shift from auto to transit. So that's that 1-to-1 that we were thinking about and talking about before. But then there's some other things that are going on. There's reduced congestion in a city or an urban region where there's a high level of transit service. You might have lower car ownership. In an urban area where there's maybe locations closer together, you might have shorter trips. And there might be other aspects of that connection between transit and land use that raise that displacement value. And so this leads to this, what they're calling the transit paradox, which is the transit agency themselves, if they are increasing their operations, if they're running more bus miles, or if they're carrying more people in the scope of their operations, they may actually be increasing their agency emissions from one time period to the next. But in the course of doing so, on a community-wide basis, on a regional basis, they might be reducing the overall transportation emissions. And so that's the paradox, is one goes up and one goes down. So the Association of Public Transit Agencies has been working on this question, and they've sort of provided some guidelines to transit agencies and people who are looking at it. And they're suggesting that there be a national sort of default placeholder leverage factor of 1.9 that would be used. This is based on some statistical analysis and review of a number of studies. And this would be a sort of an average number for the national basis. Some areas, some cities might be higher, some might be lower. And the question is sort of, well, how much higher, how much lower? How do we figure out where and when that happens? In the case of Philadelphia and New York, they've done some analysis, and they've sort of come out with an N number that they think is sort of their leverage number or their multiplier number. And so for the case of Philadelphia, using the national average, that default 1.9, they end up with a total leverage factor of 3. There's sort of a leveraging of transit and land use. There's also a leveraging of things like that, traffic congestion and other things that are happening. So Philadelphia region ends up with this estimate of 3. You can think of it as basically for any ton of greenhouse gas emissions produced by the transit agency, they think they're saving 3 tons. New York has done a very specific analysis for the New York region. They put some resources into this, and they've come out with a region-wide estimate that they believe is correct of 8 or greater. It's actually about 8.25. So they think that for every ton of greenhouse gas emissions produced, they're actually saving the region 8+ tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the end of the second sort of part. Maybe this is a very interesting area, you know, and this might be the first time that you've sort of heard something about this. So I'm very interested in what questions you have. Let's start from the back row.
Hi. Can you tell me what goes into those two, the Philadelphia and the New York City ratios? Are those just transportation greenhouse gas savings, or are they taking into account build environment savings, greater densities in the build environment?
Well, my understanding is it's all on the transportation side. So they're not necessarily taking into account, say, energy savings or greenhouse gas savings from more efficient buildings. But that's a fair question. Yes?
I'd just like to try and understand a little bit more the underlying assumption. In the New York case, is it that if the transit system wasn't there, all of those trips would effectively be highway trips, and so we'd end up with a lot of those emissions? And if that's the case, is it ever conceivable that you could have a highway system in New York that could ever replace all of those transit trips? In fact, the only reason why New York's able to exist in the way that it does at the density that it does is because the transit system's there. If the transit system wasn't there, I don't think that the whole system would function if everything was just on a highway.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you know, you'd want to look at the analysis in more detail to sort of try to figure that out. But I think that is the basic idea. It's sort of, what is the counterfactual case? You know, are they suggesting by the analysis that in the absence of any of the transit system, you'd have, you know, that X many more with the same amount of travel going on in the region, just people not using transit? So I think that's a fair question. But this is, you know, this is very recent analysis. This is, you know, new data that's coming out, and it's a very intriguing set of information that's coming out. Was there one more in the back over there? Okay. Over here? Yes.
Does it work? Sorry.
Let me just say that the term that I've been trying to think of the right words to use, the term I'm using is carbon avoidance or something, some concept like that. You know, it's sort of like, well, what's the carbon avoided? It's not necessarily a forward-looking number, but it's sort of looking at the current situation as compared to a counterfactual situation. And of course, it all does depend on sort of how you measure those things. Go ahead.
So I'm curious on how you're doing the analysis for the future scenarios with the increased transit. What tools do you use?
I mean, it's a wide range of tools that you probably learn in a master's transportation planning program.
So are you using just transportation demand models or some
that's part of it.
emission
Is,
models?
I mean, you might use a regional travel demand model, but then there might be some additional analysis around that. I mean, the hard part of that, of course, is, you know, trying to capture in some way what's going on in the interaction between transit and land use. But that's why I'd say it's still a developing area. You know, how do we get at this question is I think you know, very important. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's just the term you just used.
Microphone.
The term just used in the last question. I'm still unclear about the relationship between the land use and transit. How they are interrelated.
Well, I mean, that's, you know, this is a, let me try to bounce that back to all of you. I mean, can each of you think of how this leveraging might happen? You know, we had a little short list, but I think if we went around the room, people might think of, you know, a range of possibilities. Are there things that come to mind as to how transit and land use are related to one another? Yeah, it's worth at least a couple of dissertations, right?
Or a whole course that Professor Clifton here teaches.
You want to say anything to that?
Sorry, that's not what I meant to do.
So the question is, what are the ranges of ways that land use might influence transit?
And vice versa, yeah.
Yeah, so providing those supportive densities to make, to shorten trip ends for one, I think would be the simplest approach. So making it more competitive with a car by, if you increase the density, then you're effectively shortening the origins and destinations. But we could go on, but I would just suggest you take the transportation and land use class. We could talk about it in more depth.
There we go.
But while I have the microphone, I do have a quick question.
Please, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
So just following up on Jeff's question about the counterfactual, so you are assuming that transit would replace auto trips, that it's not replacing some non-motorized trips as well?
Well, I guess I should be very careful. All I'm doing right here is I'm reporting somebody else's analysis. So, you know, it's very intriguing work, and, you know, the MTA work was done by the MTA. They hired some consultants to do it. And so some transit agencies are looking at this question in-house with their own staff, and some of them are looking, you know, they're supplementing their in-house capabilities with some outside analysis.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. One more question, then let's try to move on.
Just based on that, do you know if there are transit agencies that are looking at their own emissions productions in terms of, you know, some investments they make may have better outcomes in terms of reducing greenhouse gases than others? You know, for example, using bus routes in the suburbs where they might get low ridership, like on a per capita basis. Do they examine that?
I think what you're raising is a very important sort of where this is going question, and I think that's why this is important as well. This kind of analysis, this sort of information is I think has the potential to be very helpful to agencies and the communities that they, you know, work in to understand what the performance is of these transit agencies. Obviously, if you have more riders per given seat mile or bus mile or, you know, vehicle mile, then your performance will be better on these measures, right? So I think there's a lot of, you know, potential for looking at this in a productive way. So the third section, and I promise this is the last section that I wanted to talk about today, is about the goods movement side, and in particular some of the port analysis and the potential for greenhouse gas emissions from the ports. I was thinking about it. The difference between ports and the rest of an urban area is oftentimes we don't necessarily see what's going on in the port directly. I mean, we live and we travel through the urban area. We see the transit system. We see the roads. But we don't necessarily see the port. And that's sort of, I'd say a lot of people on the freight side, you know, they probably feel that way as well. You know, a lot of people take for granted, you know, something shows up at your house, you know, somebody delivers it in a truck, and you don't necessarily think about it. But if we look at the numbers, you know, in terms of goods movement, it's a significant share of the transportation emissions. Light-duty vehicles are the biggest share, but as I tried to mention earlier, you know, once you try to tackle the vehicle side with fuel efficiency measures, and you look at the fuel side, you know, you've got other pieces that become increasingly important to address. And goods movement, heavy-duty vehicles, you know, trucking, shipping, rail, these are sections of the transportation sector that are increasingly of interest to people. In the ports in particular, this is a nice sort of summary of where emissions come from in terms of greenhouse gases from different port activities. So some of this goes to sort of protocol type terminology, but you have direct emissions. These are things that the port operations are directly responsible for. Your fleet vehicles, the buildings, again, the electricity in the buildings that you run, maybe your waste, your water systems, things like that. And then you have indirect purchased electricity from buildings and operations. And then you have what's called Scope 3, port tenants, indirect, ships, trucks, cargo handling equipment, rail, harbor craft, buildings, purchased electricity. So there's, in that sort of hidden world of the port system, there's a range of sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a lot of transportation going on in there. This is another sort of set of categories just sort of showing you those same categories related to the marine ports. So we've done some preliminary analysis. There have been some inventories done by others on greenhouse gas emissions for the Port of New York and New Jersey, which is one of the largest ports in the country. And this is how it's shown to break down. The largest part of emissions related to heavy-duty vehicles. That's a lot of truck travel, for example. And the other categories, ocean-going vessels, harbor craft, cargo handling equipment is a big piece of the pie, and rail. There's some discussion in some ports about trying to move the movement of cargo from the truck side to the rail side. You know, there's lots of different sides to this question that people are looking at and talking about. We did some preliminary scenarios sort of showing potential ways that maybe the baseline scenario could change. We have a conservative scenario, a moderate scenario, an aggressive scenario. These are just hypothetical scenarios at this point. But remember that thing that I told you at the beginning? We found, under the aggressive scenario, potentially 5 million metric tons. And believe it or not, it's very hard to find 5 million metric tons. And this is probably such maybe an unrealistic scenario, but it's a very strong scenario. But in order to reach those goals of stabilization that the scientific community is saying that we as a world should be reaching for, we're looking for tons in different places. And that's sort of the level of tons that a preliminary analysis might show you from these major ports. So just for fun, this is a part that my little boy likes the best. I showed him this part. He got excited about this part. So what are we talking about at the ports? This is like plugging in the ship when it docks. Instead of burning the fuel when it's right there, we have this called shore power. So the ship might plug right into the electrical grid. The ships themselves, they have the cargo handling equipment. The question is about what kind of equipment's used and how efficient that is and what type of fuel and how it's used and so forth. These tugboats and other smaller harbor craft, that assist the ships are important to that. The efficiency of those vehicles, the efficiency of the engines, what kind of technology is used. You can see there's a lot of activity in the ports that are important to consider, how that activity happens, what type of vehicles are moving those things around, the trucking, the rail systems, the type of engines and locomotives for the rail systems. All of those factor into these questions. Probably maybe one of the most commonly known sort of technologies has to do with something they call anti-idling. Truck drivers around the country, they have a tendency to keep their engines on even if the truck isn't moving. So they have these technologies which are called truck stop electrification. The truck can plug in to the electrical grid. They can also even get air conditioning, and that keeps them from continuing to burn the fuel, the diesel fuel in the truck. We did some analysis at a national level based on building up from our state's work. And so for truck anti-idling, we're showing some pretty big numbers. This is a scenario for the year 2020 where nationally you could save 1.7 billion gallons of diesel fuel. You might find 20 million metric tons. That's a big number. And then on the cost side, this is an example where, because of fuel savings, the strategy can potentially pay for itself and also lead to a net dollar savings cost per ton. And finally, there's another set of scenarios we've done, shifting goods movement from truck to rail, and another big set of numbers. This is sort of a potential scenario, but also potentially a cost-saving scenario at the national level of $7.6 billion potentially of net cost. Also a large number, pretty significant, and potentially something to look at. So that wraps up sort of the scenario and some of the data we have under those three sections. We talked about low carbon fuels and transit and land use and ports and goods movement, so we've kind of covered the landscape. Of course, there's a lot more to say, and there's many more courses to take, many more things to learn, but I think however you'd like to use the time for more questions.
Some additional questions, particularly if people haven't asked one yet. And I do have several on the web, from the web, if we don't have additional ones here. Go ahead. I think, does that work?
I've heard that I think at least in the Port of Los Angeles, in their own mind, believe they're a poster child for this. Do you have any reading on what their efficiency was in their recent efforts?
Well, I don't know all the details of what you might be thinking about, but in the state plan for the AB 32 implementation plan for the state of California, they do include quite a bit of estimated reduction from port operations, from shore power, and from also vehicle, ocean vessel operations. Just kind of what we're finding in many different modes of travel is that if you just slow down, that works for airplanes and ships and trucks and automobiles equally. If you're just slowing down, sometimes you get a better fuel efficiency. Yes.
I know you're just reporting data, but do you know the different methods that were taken as far as conservative, moderate, and then the aggressive approach to get those different values?
I do know about this because we were involved in this. I mean, part of it has to do with basically two sets of things. Your assumed growth rate, sort of what's the growth in a business's usual scenario, and then what do you think is the potential for efficiency through these new practices or new technologies. So in the end, it's sort of the combination of all those new technologies and practices, what's the potential for getting that. And some things, like you say, you can look at a picture and you can sort of say, okay, truck anti-idling, maybe you can see that happening faster in more places. But some things might take more time, might be harder to do, might cost more money to implement. And that really goes to, whether a scenario is realistic or not. Does that help? Yeah, go ahead.
Considering the pressure that the business sector is putting on trucks as being a preferable mode of transport over rail because of smaller lot sizes to meet just-in-time sorts of constraints and people ordering from Amazon and therefore smaller loads, what do you think would be some of the factors to help encourage more shifting from truck to rail?
Yeah, I mean, obviously for any sort of travel, there are many reasons why things go a certain way. It's not just for these reasons. We're talking about energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a complicated sort of decision making that's going on, I guess I'm sort of saying I don't have a clear answer. I'm not the guy who makes those decisions. Yes.
I have a question about what kind of miles per gallon you used in terms of the efficiency of the fleet now and in 2030, and the type of fuels that you were thinking about.
Are you talking about
for trucking? For trucking?
For trucking?
And then if you could comment on rail too.
Yeah, I think, for trucking and for rail, that's fair. I think that, especially now that the policymakers have sort of moved in the direction where they've adopted these new standards for light-duty cars, there's a lot of interest in can the trucks themselves be more efficient, more efficient engines and the way that the trucks operate and so forth. So, I think I don't have, all the numbers in front of me, but there's quite a significant potential based on technology that's off the shelf. Sometimes it's just a matter of, whether the trucks are newer trucks or older trucks. I mean, they're going to be more efficient engines and trucks coming out more recently.
So, but you don't have the numbers, but percentage-wise, what was the increase in efficiency? Just a rough number. You cannot tell us anything?
Yeah, I mean, say for these scenarios, the conservative scenario we were talking about basically like a 2 to 3% reduction efficiency increase. For the moderate scenario, we're talking about maybe a 7% increase. So we're not talking about necessarily doubling fuel efficiency, for example. We're talking about fairly incremental. The aggressive scenario was pretty aggressive. You're sort of assuming like a 20% improvement from your starting point. So that's considered an aggressive scenario. Does that help? Jennifer?
So we have a few questions on the web. I think
Please.
some of them have been answered, but one, and I think this is going back to the the transit leveraging, transit land use leveraging.
Oh, okay.
Part of
Sure.
the discussion. And do you know if that took into account the carbon savings from reduced infrastructure required? So in other words, if you don't have to build as bigger roads, there's some carbon impact of building the road itself, not just the transportation side of using the road.
I do not believe that that was considered in this, but that's a fair question. But that's a good question.
Going back to the first third of the presentation, you had a bar graph that showed the relative cost of biofuels.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if that also takes into account substantial federal farm subsidies on the ag industry, and if it doesn't, like how much would that be? How much would that impact the relative cost of biofuels?
Well, the analysis that we did not take that into account. What we did was I mean, certainly there are lots of factors you could take into account, but these estimates come from an estimation of the costs associated with vehicles changing over so that they can utilize the higher levels of biofuels, the costs of producing the fuel, but maybe not as deep into the details as you're suggesting. This is actually, we believe this is actually an underestimate because there's another set of costs that relates to the fueling infrastructure. Basically, you know, for the pipelines and things like that, you can't mix the biofuels using the same pipelines as gasoline or diesel. You might have to set up a whole separate set of infrastructure in order to carry these alternative fuels. So we think this may be an underestimate on the cost side.
And I think we're at about the end of our time. So before we thank you, I'll put the plug. Next week we'll be hearing about the next generation of adaptive signal systems. So switching gears, but still potential carbon emission reductions from that. So thank you very much, Lewison.
Thank you.
Regarding the land use, you know, I was thinking about, you know, this is increased efficiency with a lot of these vehicles, but there's still like a high demand for more roads and more encroachments in places like Los